The Brave and the Bold is an upcoming DC Studios movie that will introduce the DCU's version of Batman and feature Bruce learning that he has a biological son with Talia al Ghul, named Damian Wayne, who becomes Robin. This movie will also feature other members of the Bat family, with Nightwing in particular basically being confirmed to at the very least be appearing at some point in Chapter 1. But while we do know a lot about this movie, more so in fact than the closer to release Superman Legacy, we don't know who the main villain will be, so just like what I did with Superman Legacy, I'll be going over every potential character who might be the main villain of The Brave and the Bold, with the qualifying factors including 1. They have to be a Batman villain or a villain group, and 2. They either have to have been hinted at by James Gunn in some capacity, or, and this is kind of 3, there were important villains in the story that this movie is based on. So make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's begin with what is probably the most obvious candidate, Talia al Ghul. The story that this movie is based on is Batman and Son, of which Talia al Ghul is the main villain. According to James Gunn, the movie is also inspired in general by the entire Grant Morrison run on Batman, and the image that's used to represent this movie is a story called Batman vs. Robin, in which Batman is Dick Grayson, but also the main villain there is Talia al Ghul yet again. And while yes, this movie is taking inspiration from the entirety of Grant Morrison's run on Batman, it is specifically the story Batman and Son that the synopsis of the movie is pointing to, so I think we could assume that it can be considered a loose adaptation of sorts of Damian's debut in the comics, although they'll definitely change a lot of things because honestly it's not that great of a comic and it's not all that great a characterization for Damian, but I think some elements will remain, potentially including Talia al Ghul as the main villain, as well as her army of Man-Bats, or maybe Man-Bat himself. I'll get to that in a minute, but before that there's Talia al Ghul. With this movie being an actual adaptation of Batman and Son, it lends much more credence to the possibility that they'll use the same villain as opposed to Superman Legacy's inspiration, All-Star Superman, which was the main reason why Lex Luthor, who's the main villain of All-Star Superman, was considered for that video, but this is a lot more likely. Talia al Ghul, I think, is probably the most likely candidate for who's going to be the main villain of this movie. Talia will appear in this movie regardless, and at that point there isn't really much to do with her beyond her own League of Assassins goals, so it's less a matter of asking about whether or not she'll be a villain, and more a question of whether or not she'll be the villain of the movie. And I can see it going either way. Maybe she's the main villain, maybe another villain is orchestrating her plan and using her as a pawn, maybe Ra's al Ghul is around and she's doing his bidding or working beside him. All those possibilities are conceivable and there's no evidence to point to which one it'll be. What I would say, however, is that I think the most likely of these possibilities is that Ra's al Ghul will be the main villain, since if Talia is the main villain like she is in the comics, then that means that Ra's al Ghul is either dead or for whatever reason isn't participating in the story, and I just don't see them either killing off or even benching such an important Batman villain before he gets a chance to appear or, just do anything. Now, we have seen Ra's al Ghul as the main villain of a Batman movie before, specifically in Batman Begins, but that version was a more realistic take on the character in a more grounded world. The more fantastical comic version with the Lazarus Pits and the immortality might just feel like something we haven't seen before, in a movie that is, since he was used on Arrow and on Gotham. But all of that goes for Talia as well, as she also has been used as the main villain of a movie before, specifically The Dark Knight Rises, where she was the true villain behind all of Bane's actions. So honestly, Bane wasn't really the main villain, she was. So these are villains we've seen before in movies and on TV with more fantastical versions of those characters, but we haven't seen is that in a movie, but also we actually have never seen these two characters on screen together. So I think the most likely possibility here is honestly not Talia al Ghul as the main villain, not Ra's al Ghul as the main villain, and not some other villain as the main villain, but both of them, Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul, sharing the spotlight as the main villains of this movie, which would work really well because then you would have like Batman fighting Ra's al Ghul, like Ra's is his main antagonist, while Damian's main antagonist is his mother, Talia al Ghul. Now these are the first villains I'm covering, but they're also, in my opinion, the most likely. Like my prediction at the end is going to be Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul. That is who I think the main villains will be. It's a bit obvious because the story surrounds the League of Assassins, but also I think the most obvious choice is also the most likely one. But for the rest of the video, I'll be looking at every other possible candidate, and there are a lot. There's 9 other candidates for who could be the main villain or maybe a side villain, and I'll go over whether or not I think they have side villain potential. Like, maybe they will appear in this movie, because I do think a lot of Batman villains will be appearing in this movie who won't necessarily have a large role. So I'll predict their role in this movie, even if it isn't all that big. There is one other character to go over who is from this story, but all of the rest are hints from James Gunn. I did mention earlier that Talia creates an army of man-bats in the Batman and Son story, which, yeah, sure, can be used in the same way, so you have like an army of man-bats that Batman and Robin and maybe the rest of the Bat family fights, but I honestly think a more interesting route to go down is to make the main man-bat, Kirk Langstrom, the main villain. Now, Kirk isn't the main villain of this story. In fact, he's not even a villain in this story. He is reformed at this point and was forced to give the League of Assassins his man-bat serum. Plus, on top of that, he's never been hinted at, so he really shouldn't qualify for this video, but I am making an exception due to the sheer amount of man-bats this story has, and the opportunity that presents. Man-Bat, I think, is a unique villain in that there aren't many Batman villains who have, one, never been used before, but also have main villain potential. That also is one of the more fantastical enemies of the Caped Crusader, which can draw a very, very clear line between the villains that the Batman universe could use and what the DCU is going to be using. Characters like Clayface, who I will mention later, characters like Killer Croc, and Man-Bat, who I do not think would ever appear in the Batman universe, could all appear in some capacity here. Now, I do think adding a third-party villain aside from the League of Assassins might make the movie feel a bit disjointed from the rest of the story, but these movies can make changes to the characters' backstories to allow for the structure of the story to work without feeling disjointed. So, I think a potential way for this to work is that Kirk Langstrom was coerced into creating the Man-Bat serum for the League of Assassins, but when he didn't finish it in time, they killed his wife. He then injected himself with the serum, turned himself into Man-Bat, who was also much more powerful here than he is in the comics, and swore revenge against the League of Assassins, which leads to Talia bringing Damian to Bruce, as he'd be much safer with him. I will reiterate that Man-Bat is probably a bit unlikely, at the very least to be the main villain. I think to be a side villain and to appear in some capacity, Man-Bat is very likely, due to the role in the comic, but as the main villain, I think he's far less likely than the villain I already went over, but he is one of the villains I'd personally like to see the most. I think he could be really, really cool, and the first true, like, real fantastical main villain of a Batman movie. But it's probably unlikely. So those are all the candidates from the story. The Joker does also appear in that story, but not in any substantial role at all, so he will not be considered. Plus, if they go down the route of having the Joker as the main villain of this movie, I think people will be a bit angry. The Joker fatigue is starting to set in, but there's still 8 more villains to go over, all of whom have been included in this video because they've been hinted at by James Gunn on social media. Most of these villains wouldn't really work, and their hints don't really hold much weight, so I'll go over those ones briefly, but also maybe some of them could be side villains, before getting to the ones who I think actually have a shot of being the main villains of this movie. There's Dr. Phosphorus, a Batman villain who's actually been confirmed to be appearing in the DCU, so he could have had his own category, but I'm not going to be talking about him much because he's a Creature Commandos character. I think he's going to be remaining in the Creature Commandos side of things, which is also somewhat connected to the Suicide Squad of things, and will mostly remain at that side of the DC universe, not coming over to Gotham, especially since while he is a Batman villain, he's not exactly a prominent Batman villain, and could very easily just be the villain of some other hero. It doesn't really matter. And then there's Bat-Mite, who has been hinted at a few times by James Gunn, but not only would he clearly not fit the story at all, but also Gunn kind of confirmed that he isn't appearing at all with this reply to a tweet, so we can pretty easily eliminate him from the equation. Then there's the Court of Owls and Mr. Freeze, who were featured in the IGN poll top 10, which means that aside from another villain I'll get to in a second who are a bit higher than them on the list and probably will be appearing, these two villains, or rather villain group for Court of Owls, are the most requested Batman villains to be the main villains in this movie. However, Gunn replied to this saying, "Will 5 of 10 do?" confirming that only 5 of the characters in this poll out of the 10 will be appearing, and out of the 10, these 2 Batman villains seemed the least likely, as they haven't been hinted at anywhere else and are much more likely to appear in the Batman universe, especially the Court of Owls. That being said, I think Mr. Freeze not only has a much higher chance of actually being one of those 5 characters, but also I really would not mind him being the main villain in this movie. A similar story to what I said about Man-Bat could be used with Mr. Freeze in regards to his wife, and in fact, it would fit Mr. Freeze a lot better because his wife is a lot more iconic than Man-Bat's, but at the same time, I think adapting a story called One Bad Day Mr. Freeze and combining it with Batman and Son might make for a good movie. The story was set during Dick's time as Robin, but just substituting Dick for Damian and merging that in with the Batman and Son story with Mr. Freeze as the main villains and then Talia or Raish as the side villains honestly could work really well, but like I said, it's not all that likely. Mr. Freeze is a lot more likely than the Court of Owls, sure, but I do think both villains aren't all that likely and have a higher probability of being used in the Batman universe. One Batman villain I almost forgot to include is the Red Hood, and the reason I almost forgot to include him is because I don't really see him as a villain anymore, and that's completely involuntary. Like, I scrolled through all the characters who have been hinted at multiple times so I don't miss anything, and it was only on that final scroll that I remembered that the Red Hood can be used as a villain, but not only that, he has main villain potential. That being said, after Batman Under the Red Hood perfected the story in animation, Arkham Knight put its own twist on it, and Titans butchered it, I think I've had my fill of this story and would prefer to skip to Jason on a redemption arc, which leads to him forming the Outlaws in his first appearance. That being said, even though this honestly isn't something I would like to see all that much, Jason would probably fit the story better than almost any other villain considering the circumstances of his resurrection in the comics. The movie and then the New 52 comic simplified it to the Lazarus Pit reviving him, but originally he was partially resurrected by Superboy Prime punching reality during the Infinite Crisis crossover, and then later fully brought back with the help of Talia al Ghul and the Lazarus Pit. But no matter how you slice it, Jason Todd's resurrection is at some point tied to the Lazarus Pits, the League of Assassins, and in most realities, not Ra's al Ghul, but Talia al Ghul. Add to that one of Jason's motivations for waging war with Batman is jealousy of being replaced as Robin. The Red Hood can very easily fit into this story. As for the likelihood of this, I wouldn't bet on it, but also I wouldn't bet against it either. Gunn did say that the movie will feature other members of the Bat family and did hint towards Red Hood at least once, but also Red Hood was in the IGN poll. But I also feel like it might be difficult for a movie to ask the audience to care about the whole story about Batman meeting his biological son, which also features Batman going up against his adopted son as well, who he thought was dead. But I don't know, maybe that will be the whole point of the movie. Initially, I didn't really put much stock into the idea of the Red Hood being the main villain of this movie, but after a bit more consideration, I do think that out of all of the villains in the entire Batman Rogues Gallery who have also been hinted at, who aren't in the story, he's the most likely out of all of those characters. But again, that doesn't include the villains who are actually in the story that it's based on. Clayface was hinted at once by James Gunn on Twitter in what I consider to be a very strong hint. Now, considering that Clayface has never been used in a movie before and also has never been properly used in live action, I would love to see Clayface appear at some point, and I think based off this hint there's a high chance that he will appear in The Brave and the Bold. However, he just isn't main villain material. And I think even if he were to appear, it'd probably be in a side villain role, maybe even something smaller like a fight scene at the beginning of the movie. He also just doesn't fit the story as the main villain. I think you could stretch other characters to make them fit the story and make them good main villains like Man-Bat or Mr. Freeze, but Clayface I think is a bit more shallow of a character, especially compared to characters like Man-Bat and especially Mr. Freeze, and doesn't hold the necessary qualities to be considered for the main villain role. Bane was hinted at as well, as James Gunn liked the tweet asking for Dave Bautista to be cast as Bane in either the DCU or the Batverse, with the Batman universe being a lot more grounded and realistic, and I think having a larger focus on Gotham City crime. I think Bane is a lot more likely to be used in the DCU. Especially since we've seen a grounded and powerless take on Bane in a realistic universe before, and I think a Venom-induced, insanely muscular, more comic-accurate version of Bane would be something we'd all rather see. As for the likelihood, I don't think it's very likely, especially since Talia al Ghul is appearing in this movie. Like I said earlier, Bane and Talia appear together as the primary antagonists in The Dark Knight Rises, and I think they want to stray as far away as possible from comparisons to other movies. And speaking of, the Batman and Son storyline was already adapted before in animated form in the DC animated movie universe movie Son of Batman. This was the first animated Batman movie in this universe. It implemented Damian Wayne as one of the key figures of the universe, and featured Deathstroke as the main villain. The movie made Deathstroke a former member of the League of Assassins, and he ended up killing Ra's al Ghul, but also he basically substituted Talia al Ghul as the main villain. Talia was actually used as the main villain in a third animated Batman movie in this universe later down the line. The reason I say all of this is because Deathstroke is probably the Batman villain who's been hinted at the most, with hints that practically confirm he's appearing somewhere. And I really hope that that somewhere isn't the Brave and the Bold, and honestly I don't think it will be. Deathstroke being the main villain of the Brave and the Bold would simply create too many comparisons and arguments for it to have ever even been considered. The movie would be too similar to Son of Batman. You'd have the Snyder Bros screaming about how the Batfleck movie was going to use Deathstroke and therefore Snyder is the blueprint or whatever, and then you'd even have a separate group, a die-hard DC fans group, saying that Deathstroke isn't a Batman villain and should be used as an enemy of the Teen Titans instead. It would be a bit of pandemonium. Where I think he's appearing is on Waller, and then potentially a Teen Titans or even a Nightwing movie down the line, and you know, maybe he'll appear in this movie as well, but certainly not as the main villain. So with all the candidates out of the way, here's every one of these villains ranked by how likely I think they are to be the villain based on all the facts and a lot of speculation I just presented. In every one of these cases, aside from herself, the assumption is that Talia al Ghul is either a side villain or at the very least will appear, but also a lot of these villains may very well appear, just not in the main villain role. The least likely is Bat-Mite, who's practically confirmed to not be appearing in Chapter 1 and just wouldn't fit this movie at all. Second least likely is the Court of Owls, who are almost practically confirmed to not be appearing in Chapter 1 as well, and wouldn't fit as there wouldn't really make sense for there to be two criminal organizations filled with cannon fodder in this movie. Third least likely is Dr. Phosphorus, who's too connected to the Creature Commandos side of things and also wouldn't fit at all. The fourth least likely is Clayface, who just isn't main villain material, but I do think he has a very high likelihood of appearing in this movie. Then there's Mr. Freeze, who's also almost practically confirmed to not be appearing in Chapter 1 like the Court of Owls. However, he would kind of fit, and like I said, he's a lot more likely to be one of those 5 characters than the Court of Owls are. Then there's Deathstroke, who would be too similar to Son of Batman and draw too many comparisons to the potential Batfleck movie. I think it would be dumb, however, DC has done stupider things in the past. Then there's Bane, which would make the movie a little bit too similar to The Dark Knight Rises, but I think you can make a version of Bane who's different enough, you know, the powered up version, that maybe can make the character feel distinct. However, because of the similarity to The Dark Knight Rises, despite potentially fitting the story, he is not very likely, and in fact, this is like a clear cutoff point. The next couple of characters are significantly more likely than all the villains I've been over up until this point, including the Red Hood. Red Hood would fit surprisingly well with the story. He's never been used before in a movie and has main villain potential. The story has been a bit overdone in other media, and I think I'd prefer for him to appear for the first time after this has already happened during his redemption. But like I said, out of all of the villains who aren't in the actual story this movie is based on, Red Hood would fit the best, and he is honestly the most likely. Man-Bat has never been used in live action before, would fit the story, and has main villain potential, and also was a part of the story that this movie is based on. Then there's Ra's al Ghul by himself, which wouldn't really make sense to not appear unless he's dead. He would fit the story and definitely has main villain potential, but he's been used before. Then there's Talia al Ghul by herself, who definitely has main villain potential and was the main villain of this story, but again, she has been used before, and the most likely main villain for this movie is Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul. They've never been used before as a duo. It would definitely fit the story since Talia was the main villain, and the only reason Ra's didn't appear is because he was dead. And the real true reason why it works is because this movie is not a Batman movie, it's a Batman and Robin movie. The main characters are a duo, so the main villains being a duo, where each one has their primary antagonist, Batman fighting Ra's al Ghul and Robin fighting Talia al Ghul, makes absolutely perfect sense. So there you have it. My prediction for this movie is that Ra's al Ghul and Talia al Ghul will share the spotlight as the main villains, although Talia by herself is just as likely. And the villains I'd personally like to see the most, although they might fit a bit less, are Man-Bat and Mr. Freeze. I also think that Clayface and Man-Bat are very, very likely to be appearing as side villains in this movie. But do you agree with my predictions, or do you think it'll be someone I didn't even mention? Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Mad Hatter, the Joker? Please don't let it be the Joker. Let me know in the comments down below, and of course, as always, if you like this video, bye.